Bonjour, bienvenue. Welcome to our panel Toward International Principles on Gender Persecution, Advancing Human Rights and Accountability. My name is Payam Akavan. I'm the Human Rights Chair at Massey College, and I'm honored to be collaborating on this project under the leadership of my distinguished colleague, Professor Valerie Osterfeld, who is a professor at University of Western Ontario Faculty of Law and chair in international criminal justice. I'm very pleased to co-moderate this panel with her. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Massey College, Western's Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction, and the international human rights organization, MADRE. The impetus for our conversation today is a call by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and I should add that both Professor Osterfeld and I are special advisors, respectively, on crimes against humanity and genocide to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor has called for consultations on the creation of principles on gender persecution. The principles are meant to build on his office's 2022 policy on the crime of gender persecution, which set out a policy for his office's investigation and prosecution of persecution on grounds of gender as a crime against humanity. The prosecutor's aim is to draft these principles, and this goes well beyond his office's work. The objective is to ensure that these principles are also useful to United Nations bodies, countries, human rights activists, and others focused on addressing various forms of gender persecution, whether as a crime against humanity, as a ground for asylum under refugee law, or as a human rights violation. At the same time, the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Committee, is considering drafting a guidance document, a general recommendation on the topic of gender persecution as a human rights violation. It is in this context that we have convened this panel, and if I may add, our focus is in particular on the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. With those brief introductory remarks, I will turn the floor to my colleague, Professor Osterfeld.
Thank you so much, Payam. Our panel today is going to be structured as a discussion, as a conversation, and we have four wonderful panelists whom I'll introduce now. Here in person is Karima Benoune, and Karima is the Lewis M. Sines Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. She specializes in public international law and international human rights law, including on issues related to culture, extremism, and terrorism, as well as women's human rights. Earlier this year, she was awarded the American Society of International Law's Prominent Woman in International Law Award. Karima served as the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. She was also appointed as an expert for the International Criminal Court in 2017 during the reparations phase of the groundbreaking case Al-Hamadi, which concerned intentional destruction of cultural heritage sites in Mali. She has appeared in the media, in leading media outlets. She has addressed the United Nations Security Council, and I would commend to you her award-winning book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. She has a TED Talk that's associated with the book, and it's titled When People of Muslim Heritage Challenge Fundamentalism, and it's received more than 1.5 million views. So if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to go on YouTube and find it. The next person I'd like to introduce is online, Gisu Nia. Gisu is the founder and director of the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. The Strategic Litigation Project works on prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses around the world. She is a lawyer specialized in human rights and international criminal law. and she serves on the board of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, which seeks to promote accountability and the rule of law in Iran. Gisu started her career in The Hague, where she worked on war crimes and crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court. She lectures and publishes widely on global human rights developments as well as the rule of law in post conflict and transitional societies. Our next speaker is here in the room beside me. Huma Saeed is the Afghanistan advisor with Madre, a global women's rights organization and a sponsor of our event today. She's also an affiliated, sorry, senior researcher with the University of Leuven and an adjunct lecturer at the University of Santana. With over 20 years of work and research experience in the areas of human rights, women's rights, and post conflict justice mechanisms, Huma has worked as a senior consultant with the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and other international organizations. She has a doctorate in criminology, master's in human rights, and a bachelor's in political science, with research focusing on transitional justice and economic state crime. She's a published author in international academic journals and books reflecting on her research and experiences on transitional justice, economic state crime, and women and victims empowerment. Our last speaker is also online, Rangita De Silva de Alwis. Rangita is a globally recognized international women's human rights expert. She's on faculty at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a visiting faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She has many other important affiliations, but I wanted to mention that she is a member of the treaty body of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, referred to as the CEDAW Committee, and she serves as the focal point on women, peace, and security. She has written leading articles on a number of issues related to women's human rights, international women's human rights, comparative legal analysis on gender equality, and emerging areas of gender based violence. Following the conversation amongst the panelists, we will open up the floor for questions, both for those of you who are in the room and for those who are joining us on the live stream. So we're going to go to the first question for our panelists. And this question is directed at Rangita and Gisu. And we'll start with Rangita and then go to Gisu for the answers. The question is, what makes individuals particularly vulnerable to gender-based human rights violations that rise to the level of persecution? Over to you, Rangita.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. And thank you for your distinguished work and scholarship that influences our own work. So, when you speak about human rights violations are mostly about power and control and powerlessness and power imbalances caused by structural imbalances. And gender based human rights violations rise to even higher levels of power and control. As you know, the ICC prosecutor's policy on gender persecution in December 22 reaffirmed that gender is a social construct that can evolve over time and that reinforces the view of gender by defining gender persecution as a crime committed against persons because of sex characteristics and or because of the social constructs and criteria used to define gender. So, for gender persecution to constitute a crime against humanity, the perpetrator must target both an identifiable group or a collectivity based on grounds of gender. And those groups could include, for example, men, women, girls, boys, and LGBTQI persons. So now, in my opinion, this is a rather limited category of people. And I would like to look at the ways in which your question as to what makes individuals particularly vulnerable to gender based human rights violations is one where people of intersectional identity that go beyond sexual identity would constitute those who are most vulnerable to human rights violations that constitute gender persecution. And this would include not just gender, but race, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and those in opposition to the dominant regime, such as human rights defenders and journalists. In fact, all of those speaking truth to power, including political opponents, political dissenters, and those in the opposition to the dominant regime or class, and those women who are relatives of those who may be in political or religious opposition. Those might constitute wives, daughters, sisters of a target group. So I would like, in our own submissions to the ICC to call for that rather broadened conception of intersectionality and intersectional identity as those who are the individuals particularly vulnerable to gender-based human rights violations that amount to gender persecution. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, Gisu.
Thanks. Completely agree with Rangita on this in terms of being very careful about accounting for ethnicity, religion, looking at different minority groups and how that intersects with gender groups. The one thing that I would say that now we have to pay attention to in different contexts, and I know that this day and this panel is in part focused on Afghanistan and Iran, is the role of technology and how that can become a horrible equalizer in some of these circumstances. So, for the example of Mahsa Jina Amini, a young 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman who was killed by Islamic Republic of Iran forces for essentially maybe showing a few strands of hair. She was taken in by the IR's morality police, and then she died in their custody a few days later. She was a Kurdish woman. And so there has been a lot of literature and a lot of dissection of the fact that, she was made more vulnerable to this kind of state violence by virtue of being part of a historically oppressed ethnic minority in the country. What has emerged since that time and has really accelerated in the past few months is the use of surveillance technology in the country to police mandatory hijab. And so a lot of technology has been brought in from China. There are reports that some of that also originates from Germany, but that is sort of a horrible equalizer in a way, depending on how that technology is programmed. It now scales the ability for not just human morality police, but essentially these cameras and this technology to be able to gather women that are in violation of these codes en masse. And a lot of these things are automated. For example, if you're driving your car and you don't have mandatory hijab and you get 3 strikes, if it's 3 different occasions, then your car is automatically impounded, right? That kind of technology typically doesn't discriminate based on a human morality police officer hearing somebody's accented Persian and knowing that you might be from a minority group. That kind of technology isn't going to be clear on what religion a woman is or not, right? So I think that we also have to kind of take account of how these very rapid technological advances in some countries that are really training that technology to police women at a broader scale, how that's going to factor into the analysis and what makes people vulnerable. I could add a bit more, but I think I'll leave that there.
Thanks so much.
My question is to Karima and Huma. What are the historical, cultural, religious, and political currents that have given rise to the systematic subjugation of women and girls in Afghanistan, Iran, and other countries? Karima.
So thank you. That's a very big, very important question. And let me start by saying what an honor it is to be on this panel with so many people who have done so much work for human rights. So picking up with your question, what are the roots of these problems, particularly in the context of Afghanistan and Iran? Let me start with Afghanistan. I think one thing that is important for us to understand is the way what is happening now is a retrogression, that is a moving a very substantial moving backward on human rights. Throughout the early 20th century, there was a trajectory of advancing on women's human rights in Afghanistan under a variety of governments, though some of them may have had some serious human rights problems, but there was a women's movement and an important trend of reform. All of that, of course, begins to change catastrophically after the invasion by the Soviet Union and then the decision by the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia to support basically any group that was fighting against the Soviet Union, and especially some of the most extreme groups that were known as mujahideen groups, groups like Hizb Islami, headed by a man named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And so this kind of external promotion of fundamentalism and the most extreme forces, I think really leads to the situation we have today. It's in that climate then that the Taliban emerge. And so I think this is important to remember that this is an internationally created problem, not that Afghanistan didn't and doesn't have its own internal problems, but this means that international actors also have a particular obligation to help find effective solutions. I also wanted to say how important it is to distinguish between fundamentalism, which is the political manipulation of an extreme form of religion, basically to take power in society, to distinguish from that, and religion or culture more generally. And of course, there's a complex relationship between those two things. But in Afghanistan, the problem is not Islam per se. The problem is the political ideology of the Taliban that manipulates its version of religion as a power tool. And so I think it's very important that we not give in to kind of making cultural excuses for the Taliban. And there's lots more that I could say, but I'm eager to hear Huma's answer, and in particular on Iran as well.
Homa Khanum.
Thank you very much for the question, and it's also my honor to be part of this panel. In Afghanistan, the question of gender justice and women and girls' rights, it's considered a form of a structural harm and inequality. I recall having done a research on actually reparative measures in Afghanistan, and part of that research was addressing some of the recognition of some structural harm in Afghanistan and how to overcome them. And almost everyone I interviewed indicated the question of gender justice, women's rights as a form of structural inequality rooted in the history. This arises in part from an entrenched patriarchal system, but also superstitious beliefs. As Karima mentioned, it's not so much Islam. The problem in Afghanistan is that not only now, but traditionally, historically speaking, many women have not even enjoyed the rights that Islam grants to women for example, in other countries. There are many superstitious beliefs or traditions that unfortunately have restrained women from access to public space, education, work, etc. But importantly, as Karima also mentioned, the question of women's rights and gender justice in Afghanistan, particularly over the last 4 decades, has become heavily politicized. And it's not just under the current Taliban regime or when the Taliban regime was in power for the first time in the 1990s, but throughout Afghanistan's recent history of violent conflict that started in 1978 with the coup d'etat and then the Soviet invasion, etc. As a report, an Amnesty International report in 1999 pointed out, it basically, and I quote this, that women in Afghanistan have been a pawn in man's power struggle. They have had very limited role, perhaps no role in the fightings and violent conflicts in Afghanistan in terms of decision makings, etc. Yet they have been the main victims of conflict in the country. So when, for example, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and their People's Democratic Party regime that was in power at that time, they went on one extreme and were imposing their ideology, including in terms of gender, um, with violence, with repression, particularly in rural Afghanistan. People rebelled in some parts in Afghanistan because of how they were imposing their ideology, their understanding of women's rights. So they went to one extreme. And then this was followed when the Soviets left Afghanistan and we had the Mujahideen that the very Mujahideen Karima referred to. They took power and they started a bloody civil war from 1992 to 1996. I believe that period is not so much known to many people outside Afghanistan, but it was one of the worst periods in the recent history of Afghanistan, particularly for women. There was one research that shows that women said that they felt most insecure as women during the Mujahideen period, because the Mujahideen, they were actually the first before even the Taliban. The Taliban had not come to power by that time. They came after the Mujahideen. These Mujahideen were the first who imposed head cover. They banned women from some of their basic rights. And at that time, already they felt many restrictions in terms of going to university, school, because women were raped, women were taken into marriage by force. There were many stories of young women committing suicide, even fathers feeling compelled to kill their own daughters rather than them being raped or taken by force by one of the armed groups. It was horrible. Unfortunately, that period was not documented so well. But the people in Afghanistan, especially in big cities like Kabul, they have vivid memories, and they come across in interviews, including in the ones I have conducted with many war victims in Afghanistan. And then we had the first Taliban rule that then, as now, they imposed completely, a system that pretty much we can say deprived women and girls from all their basic and fundamental rights, just as what we see today. So this has been one side, and unfortunately, this has been a very undocumented side in the history of Afghan conflict. So one of the things that we need when we discuss accountability mechanisms for Afghanistan, and is one of the issues under discussion these days, is we need to document, to analyze, and to address ways to overcome specifically question of gender justice, trying to understand the conflict, the Afghan conflict of these four and a half decades through the lens of women themselves, their stories, their narratives, their experiences that are so untold. And the other side that I like to highlight, which again, it perhaps has not been highlighted that much, and we don't know that much about, is the resistance and the struggle of Afghan women. Throughout all these years of conflict, while women had, as I mentioned, very little role in instigating conflict, being involved in it in any active way, they try to find creative ways to raise generations of educated young men and women, including under the first Taliban rule when they were running clandestine home-based classes, schools. This is exactly what women are doing today. They're trying to find creative ways to provide education to girls and other opportunities. So that has faced and side has always also gone together with the oppression that they had to endure. And both are equally unknown, and we need work to document this, to raise this, to come up with mechanisms that can address these oppressions, including reparations to gender and sexual-based crimes.
Thank you so much. One of the terms that has been applied to the current situation of women and girls in Afghanistan has been the term gender apartheid, which was used by the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan. Karima and then Gisu, what are the links between gender persecution and gender apartheid?
Thanks so much for this question. So these are two overlapping international legal concepts with different statuses in international law, but they're not contiguous. That is to say, they have aspects which are different. So for those who are perhaps not international lawyers, gender persecution is the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of a group or collectivity, including on the basis of gender. That is clearly being practiced by the Taliban in Afghanistan and also by the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, as the UN's fact-finding mechanism on Iran has concluded. This is a problem, this is a concept that really highlights the connection between discrimination and misogyny on the one hand and deprivation of rights and violence against women and other abuses against women on the other. Gender apartheid, on the other hand, is a term that references inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime that is aimed at systematic oppression and domination by one gender group over any other gender group or groups. And this is very important, committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. That, of course, is a concept that was developed to deal in the first instance with racial apartheid in Southern Africa, and we are now trying to push forward a gender inclusive understanding of apartheid to include gender apartheid. That very clearly is being practiced in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan as well, where you see the whole central ideology of the Taliban is really founded on the systematic subjugation of women. It's one of the sort of central tenets of their governing philosophy. And I think the question as to whether the concept also applies in Iran is perhaps a bit more complicated. I'm happy to come back later and talk about my own view on this. I know some Iranian women human rights defenders support that approach. Others do not. I think many Afghan women human rights defenders support also the gender apartheid approach. So we need both of these concepts. They recognize different aspects of the intent of these particular crimes. So with regard to gender persecution, the focus in terms of intent is on the intent to cause severe deprivation of fundamental rights and the intent to discriminate. But with gender apartheid, the intent is focused on maintaining that regime of gender oppression. And I think this means that gender apartheid also helps to explain why gender persecution is happening. It helps to remind us that these are political questions about political governance choices, not just questions of religion or culture. And we know from the history of the treatment of racial apartheid, we know that the International Court of Justice rejected cultural and religious justifications, which the South African government also tried to use for its discriminatory system of governance. The two concepts have a different status. So gender persecution is codified in the Rome Statute thanks to the very hard efforts of women human rights defenders. It can and should and must be prosecuted before the International Criminal Court and relevant national courts. And I hope that we will see prosecutions of Taliban leaders for gender persecution. Gender apartheid, I would describe more as an emerging norm, which is gaining more and more support, including from states. 10 states have suggested that gender apartheid should be included in the new Crimes Against Humanity Convention that the UN is drafting. The UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan and the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls have both supported codification of this crime as well as its application in Afghanistan. And perhaps most importantly, historically, we see strong support from a number of prominent Black feminists in South Africa who were anti-apartheid advocates. And this includes people like Penny Andrews, the first Black woman dean of a law school in South Africa. This includes Navi Pillai, former High Commissioner for Human Rights. This includes Rashida Manjoo, a former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. This also includes a figure no less important than Graça Machel, the former First Lady of South Africa, the widow of Nelson Mandela, who have endorsed the gender apartheid approach. Much more I could say, but eager to hand over to Gisu.
Gisu, over to you.
Great. I think Karima really covered it. The only things that I would add are just to reinforce that really the distinction that we see these crimes as complementary. So the push to codify the crime of gender apartheid is for a few reasons, but ultimately it does have that distinguishing intent and the animating context, and that is unique among other international crimes. That's already been accepted with having both racial apartheid and racial persecution set as crimes currently. So this should not be that aspect should not be a controversial matter, because I think a lot of times there at least initially there was a question around why the crime of gender apartheid would be needed if we already have gender persecution on the books. And really it is about this distinguishing intent and animating context. It has a fundamentally discrete mens rea, as Karima just described here. And what that means is that when we can acknowledge that crime, it really helps to underscore that institutionalized and ideological nature of the violations that are occurring with the crime of apartheid. And that's important because that also helps international actors respond appropriately. I believe that will recognize the true nature of what we see as a distinctive crime. And it also helps to equip diplomatic, legal, and human rights, communities and actors with a stronger tool with which to really mobilize action and to hold the regimes that are perpetrating this crime accountable. So that's all I'd add, that really there is a distinction here, but we do see the crimes as complementary.
And if you don't mind, Gisu, I'll go off script for just a moment and I'll just explain to the audience, in case you haven't been following this or not aware of this. In the United Nations General Assembly, there's a legal committee. That legal committee is looking at a draft treaty called the Draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention. And the reason they're looking at this is because we don't actually have a treaty on crimes against humanity. We have one on genocide. We have a number of war crimes, the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, but we don't have one on crimes against humanity. And what that draft looks like at the moment is they took the crimes against humanity definition from the International Criminal Court statute, which includes gender persecution and racial apartheid, and they put it into this convention, draft convention. And so it's that convention that's being discussed. And as Karima and Gisu mentioned, there is lobbying happening. There are arguments by states being made that the apartheid definition should be amended to refer to gender apartheid as well as racial apartheid. So that's where the discussion is happening. And Gisu, if you don't mind, what do you think are the next steps in this discussion in incorporating gender apartheid into the Crimes Against Humanity Convention?
Yeah, thanks. So I think many in the audience and also on the panel will be familiar with the fact that gender apartheid as a concept is something that Afghan activists and Iranian activists have been using for decades. Apartheid jinsiati. This is not a new concept, and they have definitely used that to describe the situations that they are living in and under. I think what has really accelerated just in the past few years is the push to codify this crime. Of course, Karima has engaged in scholarship for years, really laying out what that should look like legally. Many other authors as well have contributed to this body of literature, really exploring that. In terms of brass tacks, what's now on the table, as Karima mentioned, there are 10 states that have specifically signaled support at the Sixth Committee, the legal committee at the UN General Assembly. And that's a cross-regional group of states, which is incredibly important. We have the Philippines, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, Australia, Austria, the list goes on. But it's really important that it's cross-regional because it shows that this isn't something that a Western state has proposed or anything like that. And in fact, the calls are really coming from civil society in Afghanistan and in Iran. What is clear is that Malta, one of the states that is part of this group of 10, has now proposed a definition, which is the definition that Karima just shared. And that is also the definition that's included in the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Afghanistan, Richard Bennett's report that he had published in June and presented to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And so this is sort of what we're looking at for the next few steps. What I would say is that there's an important moment coming up in October. On October 10th, there will be a meeting, a resumed session of the Sixth Committee, and there's going to be a decision on whether or not the Crimes Against Humanity draft treaty, which this has been an ongoing thing for about a decade or more, whether or not that's going to move to negotiations. If and when that happens, then we will be in a good position for civil society, supportive states, and others to really push for the inclusion of gender apartheid in that treaty. Obviously, the discussions have already been happening for about a year and a half now, but the next moment is really to see whether this goes to negotiations. The other very quick thing I'll mention is that there are other pathways open for how we acknowledge gender apartheid, how we codify that. And an Iranian human rights lawyer who may be known to some of you, Shadi Saad, just put out a great piece on just security that looked at the revival of the discussion around the Apartheid Convention of 1973, obviously given recent developments in Israel-Palestine and some of the judicial developments that are coming out of that. There's a sort of a renewed discussion on whether or not there could be some kind of inclusion of gender in a revisited definition. We also know that there are other routes in terms of country to country, adding this in domestic legislation. I know Karima also has other thoughts on how we could get this included, but we're really looking to October 10th as kind of the next key moment to see what happens from there.
Thank you.
My question is again to Gisu and Karima. What responses to gender persecution and gender apartheid have we seen from the international community to date, and what responses are still needed? Gisu.
Well, I just covered a bit about the gender apartheid piece and what I think is needed there. But if I may also say that a lot of this is focused on, the legal pathways, but there's also a reality around how do we actually address the fact that gender apartheid is continuing to be perpetrated and committed. How do we get those regimes to stop engaging in the practice? And I really think that that's going to require a set of diplomatic and policy tools that currently are not being prioritized, I would say. So along this journey to try to raise greater awareness of what gender apartheid as a crime is, I think there also needs to be better engagement with states that, for example, are seeking to normalize the Taliban, that are turning embassies in Europe over to Taliban control, right? There needs to be more of a conversation around that, because that is how we're going to actually mobilize the tools to stop these regimes from perpetrating the crimes that they're perpetrating. Just quickly on the point of gender persecution, I'm currently working on litigation that is going to bring gender persecution claims in the Iran context, and that is really looking at the findings of the UN fact-finding mission on Iran, which found gender persecution as a crimes against humanity had been committed in the protests that began in September 22 and 2022 in the country. And in our scoping, I think, this is no secret to all of us, but there is such a lack of jurisprudence on gender persecution, and it's really quite stunning that the crime has been in play in the Rome Statute for quite some decades, and that there really is limited jurisprudence to draw from. And obviously, that's due to a range of factors. But I'd say that in the context of Afghanistan or in the context of Iran, where things are unquestionably based around gender, where there aren't a whole lot of other variables that one could point to say that is the distinctive factor for why these actors are perpetrating specific crimes, that there's really an imperative to build out this jurisprudence further. And I'll take note that it's interesting that at the ICC, I think 2 out of the 3 cases where it's been charged do involve male victims, which of course can also be victims of this crime. And that's very important to recognize that there's a range of victims. But it is, I think, for people who are sort of fresh and new to this area of the law and who aren't necessarily gender legal experts, it's always quite stunning to see sort of the lack of jurisprudence that has been developed in this space. So that's just a note on, I think we need to continue to encourage progressive development of these definitions and push for this jurisprudence and ensure that judges really, have a progressive understanding of what this needs to look like, as well as practitioners.
Karima?
So I agree with everything that Gisu just said. I want to pick up on the issue of gender persecution. I think we have to do a great deal to build and make sure that we have the climate for the strong jurisprudence on gender persecution that we need. And if you're interested in this question, I encourage you to take a look at the verdict in the El Hassan case coming out of the occupation of the north of Mali by jihadist groups in 2012 that were engaging in some similar practices to the Taliban, although the contexts are different. And what is very distressing in that case is that, in fact, the judges were able to recognize persecution on religious grounds, but not on gender grounds, which was, I think, really shocking for Malian women's groups who absolutely understood that one of the sort of focal points, the main targets of the jihadist groups in the north were women and women's rights. And what's particularly distressing is to look at some of the arguments that were made by the judges that produced that result. For example, the fact that there was previous discrimination against women in Mali as somehow sort of undercutting the idea that there could be gender persecution going on. That is an idea we absolutely have to tackle. Also, this claim that somehow the defendant had a mistake of law because he believed that the practices, the violations of women's rights were justified by Islamic law. We have to tackle these unacceptable cultural relativist ideas about women's rights that are going to be a challenge both with regard to gender persecution and gender apartheid. And I think that the gender apartheid framing, understanding gender apartheid as a framework within which gender persecution sometimes takes place, can help us to really teach the legal and judicial community as well that these are political practices and the religious and cultural justifications are no more acceptable here than they are when the persecution happens on religious or racial grounds, where by the time where we are now, we recognize that those would not be acceptable justifications. There were religious justifications for slavery and the slave trade as well. We now understand that is just something that is in total violation of our understanding of human dignity, and we have to arrive at the same point with regard to women's human rights. Just last thing to say on gender apartheid. I think we have to be very methodologically sound and not overstate its current legal status, but I think we also cannot wait for codification, and we need to engage in pushing international law forward, using a gender-inclusive definition of apartheid, drawing from apartheid law when we can, with the support of our South African colleagues. And I should say, when I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, I tried to do this carefully, for example, saying that the spirit of the Convention on Apartheid in Sports applied to the Taliban's ban of women participating in sports, women and girls. Clearly, the letter of that law did not apply, but the spirit applied. And I think that is how we begin to move forward while waiting for the codification that we need, because women on the ground, either in Afghanistan or in Iran, cannot wait.
Thank you so much, Karima. The next question is to Huma first and then Rangita, and it is, how should international principles on gender persecution reflect the realities of gender persecution?
Thank you. This is a big question, but to keep it perhaps short and focused on a specific points, I would say that the question of intersectionality was raised also before. That's really, really important when we discuss gender persecution. And as it was mentioned in the case of Iran, when the fact-finding mission published its reports, one of the conclusions was that the persecution, crime against humanity, gender persecution has been committed, and they noted also the intersectionality with especially ethnic and religious identities. That's really important to keep in mind when, whether as documenters, as journalists, investigators, but also judges and legal actors, while gender persecution is taking place as the main ground in countries like Afghanistan, like Iran, there are, even in that context, maybe some communities who perhaps pay even a higher price because of the intersecting identities on ethnic, political as well, and religious grounds. And we really need much more research with regard to this. Definitely in the case of Afghanistan, we need more research. We see some evidence here and there, but I think when investigators or legal actors, but also journalists and others who are engaged in documentation, we need to carefully look at these issues with that lens. That is one aspect. The other aspect is really raising awareness, the importance of raising awareness about the existence of this tool. I work through, particularly my work with MADRE, with many human rights, Afghan human rights defenders, journalists, Afghan journalists, other even legal actors, and many are unaware simply of the existence of this legal tool. As it was mentioned, this is a legal tool in the law book. So in the first place, it's really, it's very unfortunate that we don't have a conviction for this so far. Unfortunately, what happened with Mali that was just mentioned here, that was really disappointing, I think, for those of us working on these issues. But with regard to Afghanistan and also Iran, I mean, in these countries, we really see what is happening on many levels. I mean, some analysis reports, including the ones produced by MADRE, really clearly show that what is happening in these countries, what is happening particularly in Afghanistan, meets all the elements of gender persecution. Yet there is really very little awareness about it. When we do our trainings on gender justice, on how to bring justice basically to victims of sexual and gender-based violence, when we introduce this tool, many are unaware of its existence and its use, and they continuously raise the issue of need for further awareness raising, particularly among journalists. Another issue I like to point is adopting a bottom-up approach, bottom-up approach, but also survivors center, victim and survivor center. So being aware of the re-traumatization of victims, trauma-informed approach in addressing these issues, including because the documentation work we are doing or organizations are doing, as well as of course, witness testimony, etc., there can be re-traumatization to such victims, and this is something that is happening as Afghanistan. I mean, the International Criminal Court is examining the case of Afghanistan. There are organizations documenting. Luckily, now there are organizations documenting such crimes, and we are working towards creating tools, towards creating manuals on how to systematically and methodologically capture such crimes that would meet international standard. And in it, it's really important to keep in mind this survival-centered, trauma-informed approach, and working with communities on the ground to the extent possible to really capture this crime, and also the practices behind it, the discriminatory practices that are I mean, this crime is rooted in discriminatory practices. If one looks at often at the why the crime is happening. For example, when a girls' school is being attacked in Afghanistan, it was happening even during the Republic by the Taliban. Many girls' schools were being attacked, burned. Even teachers were killed, including male teachers, students. When we look at the question of why these attacks happen, we realize that actually the answer to that is discrimination on the gender ground. These schools are attacked because they are girls' school. These teachers are killed, including male teachers, because they teach to girls. So therefore, also the men in this case is the victim of gender persecution. In the other issue, I'd like to the final point in this case I like to highlight is the fact that the recognition and emphasis on the fact that victims of these crimes can be not only women and girls, but also men, boys, and people from the LGBTQI plus communities. Anyone basically who is being targeted because of their gender, because of their work on gender justice issues, including, for example, activists who are being tortured, detained because of their activism to keep schools open for girls, for example, in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to Rangita.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. And I do want to echo some of my esteemed colleagues' remarks that to pierce the veil of impunity, one must look closely at the ICC's own history. And as was so well articulated by both Karima and Gisu, throughout much of ICC's history, evidence of gender persecution has often been used to support or supplement charges of prosecution on other instances, such as religious or ethnic, and not charged as gender persecution in its own right as a standalone crime. And there is now a sense that without the added value of cumulative charging, the Office of the Prosecutor would encounter difficulty in obtaining convictions or sentences. And as Karima stated in the wake of the Al Hassan judgment of June 2024, where the chamber found Al Hassan guilty of the crime against religious grounds, but not on the basis of gender, one could argue that this reinforces the silences, the gendered silences in international law. So I also wanted to stress what was said earlier by my colleague, that it is important to adopt a survivor-centric approach and to also reinforce what the ICC's own protocols suggest, that these survivors, especially the women of Afghanistan and women of Iran, are survivors, but they are also actors of international justice rather than passive subjects. And I do want to stress that element, that these women who will probably be part of major litigation efforts should not be considered passive subjects, but actors, dynamic actors of international justice. So I want to look at very quickly, what does it mean when we say we have to recognize the needs of survivors and bring a survivor-centered approach? And that would also include access to services such as psychosocial care throughout any litigation process. So the survivor participation is key to successful litigation of gender persecution. And I would like to draw examples of our own work with leading Afghan women, that these are women who are eager to be recognized as actors of international justice rather than its passive subjects. So, what I would like to do is also to look at in the ways in which national courts and gender persecution can come together. As some of you may know, the Zepur Saco case in Guatemala was one of the first instances ever where a domestic court convicted certain militia groups of sexual slavery as a crime against humanity. And what is really salient about the Sepulzaco case was not only the ways in which indigenous women, survivors of sexual slavery, were witnesses on the stand, but the ways in which the trial itself was a transformative experience, where the women's stories were translated into local idiom, not just local language, but local idiom, in order to transform the court into a more enabling environment. So, another significant litigation tactic is to ensure, and this is not just another litigation tactic, but the central litigation tactic would be to enable the women of Afghanistan, the women of Iran to take center stage, and that the voices of Afghan women need to drive any kind of litigation effort, and that it is important that a powerful symbol of transformation is the symbol of Afghan women owning any kind of litigation process. And then I want to look at something that was not mentioned earlier, the role of reparations, and both individual and collective reparations, as well as symbolic and structural reparations. And this would involve memorializing the past history of gender persecution of Afghan women so as to keep alive the historic memory for generations to come. You know, this is the second takeover of the Taliban. I wish there was more done after the first Taliban takeover to memorialize the past and to keep alive the historic memory in Afghanistan as well as in the United States. So it is important to ensure finally that there is non repetition, that non repetition should be the guiding principles, especially in Afghanistan, where we see the repeat play of gender persecution. And then finally, reparations must go beyond the immediate reasons and consequences. They must address the structural inequalities and the ways in which those structural inequalities continue to shape women's and girls' lives. Thank you.
This brings us to a final closing thought and question before we open the floor for Q&A with the audience. And the final questions go to Rangita and Homa. And Rangita, my dear sister, a distinguished colleague, spoke about the voice of Afghan and Iranian women. And you, Homa, spoke about victim-centered justice, a trauma-informed approach. And as you were saying this, it made me think about our discussion here at Massey College, here in the comfort of Toronto and academia. And of course, it's beyond reproach, the cause of gender equality, recognizing the inherent dignity of women and girls, their the right to basic fundamental rights. But it makes me think about our discussion here, the meeting rooms of the United Nations, the Sixth Committee, and this elite bubble, the Hague bubble, ICJ cases, ICC deliberations, and the grim reality of those women and girls in Kabul, in Kandahar, in Herat, wherever they may be. How can we bridge the gap between the bubble that we live in and that grim reality? How can we try to measure the impact that what we're doing has on those who are its intended beneficiaries? So maybe by way of conclusion, Rangita and Homa, you could reflect a bit on what lessons have we learned and what more could we do to try and really connect with what is happening on the ground? Rangita, we'll begin with you and we'll end with Homa.
Thank you, Pam. Um, to echo what you have said and what Huma has said, a survivor centered approach is central, but a survivor centered approach can be just a buzz term unless we really unpack and deconstruct what it means. And in my envisioning and reimagining of a survivor centered approach, it means really addressing the narrative arc of these women's lives. And it's about storytelling. Law is about storytelling. And it is important that even long before any litigation effort, the process of storytelling and these women's voices need to be heard, need to be documented, and need to be amplified. So, my own suggestion as final remarks would be to really look at the narrative arc and the narrative power of women's stories to address gender persecution, but that it must start much before any trial date, that it must start right now, the collection of stories, the memorializing of those stories, and the ways in which the memorializing of the past is about keeping alive the historic memory of these women and their voices. Thank you.
Homa. Thank you, Rangita.
Thank you for this really very important question. It is not, I have to say, not maybe a very easy question. And it's one that I do sometimes also struggle in my own work. Perhaps many of us do that in the sense of, well, we do this work, which I think we all agree is really important, despite all the limitations that you referred to. But I do also frequently question, what is the impact of this on people, for example, in a village in Afghanistan on the ground? Or what is their thought about doing this kind of work? So I think that it's really important to answer this question. It's really important that we stay engaged with the communities who are being affected. That's why also before I mentioned the importance of taking a bottom-up approach as much as it's possible. It's not easy, of course, in countries like Afghanistan, like Iran, or maybe other countries in that similar context, conflict. There are many, many limitations, particularly in the current situation in Afghanistan, what is happening. It's not easy to reach out to communities. So many venues, possibilities, opportunities that existed before do not exist anymore. So sometimes simply establishing contact with communities on the ground can be very, very, very challenging and even dangerous. But it is not impossible. And we need to continue doing that work as much as circumstances allows us. And I know there are organizations, even if they're established in exile outside Afghanistan, they try to keep a foot on the ground. And I think that it's important to look at those reports. Or, for example, the report of the special rapporteur. Unfortunately, recently, also the Taliban banned him from traveling to Afghanistan. But when he was able to travel to Afghanistan, he actually had the opportunity to go and talk with communities, with affected people, with women inside the country, including in some of these communities, to be able to reflect their voices, their demands, and in his reports. And we need to keep doing that to the extent that is possible. And also, now much of this work in the context of Afghanistan for sure, and I think to an extent also with Iranian activists, is taken forward by the diaspora communities. I think that we have many activists who were forced to leave Afghanistan because of the security or other challenges they were facing there, and they are currently in exile, some of whom continue their activism. I think that there is a lot of credibility and legitimacy in their voices because they have that proximity, whether it's temporal proximity or geographic proximity to the communities inside Afghanistan. So it's important that we listen to those voices as well in discussing this kind of work and prioritizing, especially when and if it's not possible to reach out to people in the communities.
Now we've come to the end of our discussion, us moderators with the panelists, and we're opening it up to any questions from the audience, whether the audience is here in the room or online. Are there any questions in this audience in the room? Yes. There's a microphone if you could speak into it.
Sure. Thank you so much, all of you. Clearly, it shows that you're all experts on the topic and you have a lot of really impactful things to contribute. My question stems from something that Karima alluded to, which is that international actors have an obligation to act. And the IHRP, the International Human Rights Program, through the University of Toronto, is who I'm here kind of on behalf of. Our director just walked out, but hopefully he'll be back. And we have a working group on gender apartheid in Afghanistan right now. We're trying to compile a report essentially to raise awareness about Canada's extraterritorial obligations. So this is more of an international human rights legal question, an international law question, and I'm sure it seems like most of you, if not all of you, have that expertise. How do you see countries like Canada's obligations unfolding here? We're trying to justify in the report that customary and conventional international law are at play in this respect, especially in Canada, where we are very we put forward this feminist foreign policy. We put forward, that we strive to uphold women, peace, and security in the agenda that was put forward by the Security Council. So how do you see, let's say, as a country like Canada, where do you see Canada's role in this? And how, as students or as activists in the community, how can we kind of remind Canada of their obligations here, and what would that look like? So any of you, I know Karima, you had kind of put forward that sort of proposition, so I would be curious. Thanks.
Is there another question? Should we gather some questions if there is another question in the audience here? No? Then maybe we will go to this question. Do either of you here in the room, Huma or Karima, have anything to say? And then I will go to Gisu and Rangita online to see if they have anything to say.
Well, first of all, thank you for this question, and thank you for your important work trying to raise this issue. So I think, we talked a lot today in our bigger meeting about an all-tools approach. So using many different international legal tools to confront situations like that facing women either in Iran or in Afghanistan. And each of these tools has added value. One of the pieces of added value from the gender apartheid framework, particularly as it develops going forward with codification, is really to focus on the obligations of the international community. It's difficult to get the Taliban to change their policies in this area because they are so ideologically committed to them. But at least we can make sure, or try to make sure, that the international actors comply with international law in the way that they engage with the Taliban, and that they don't engage in ways that end up sort of either showing approval for or tolerance of grave abuses, or even worse, actually being complicit in those abuses. And if you look at the apartheid framework that was constructed to confront racial apartheid, that was actually most of what that framework was about, because most of what apartheid South Africa was doing was already a grave violation of international law. But the reason states, newly decolonized states, pushed so hard for an apartheid convention, which was finally adopted in 1973, was that they wanted to concert the effort of the international community and make clear that actually the international community had an obligation to end practices like this. And that is what we are aiming for with gender apartheid also, to get this kind of global discussion about state policy. And even while we're waiting for codification, at the very least, we have to insist that states uphold the obligations they claim to support. Clearly there is language in the Sustainable Development Goals saying that they are committed to eradicating gender equality by 2030. There's no way that they can be complicit with actors engaging in gender apartheid and actually be serious about meeting a commitment like that. Those that say they have feminist foreign policies cannot go along with approaches in which, for example, all male delegations are sent to Kabul, or in which, as we've seen recently, the United Nations actually is willing to hold a summit with the Taliban without Afghan women in the room and without Afghan women's rights even being on the agenda. And I would really like to stay in touch with you because I'm doing some further work trying to refine our approach to the issue of complicity with regard to gender apartheid. What does it mean to be complicit? For example, if UN agencies or other humanitarian agencies are willing to work with all male staffs in total violation of the UN Charter because the Taliban has told them they must, does that amount to complicity in violation of international law? And of course, the standards on complicity in international law are somewhat inconclusive, I would say, or vague. If you look at the work of someone like Stephen Ratner, he talks about that problem. So long answer, but a very important question and much more work to do in that area.
Karima, at the risk of making your answer even longer, would you mind explaining to the audience what you mean by all tools approach?
So thank you very much for the opportunity to clarify that. So this is a very important term that the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, Richard Bennett, has been using with regard to that context, saying basically that the problem is so severe that no one approach by itself can solve the problem. We need to use all of the tools available, including the international legal tools, which means it's not a question of gender persecution or gender apartheid, but in fact using both in a range of ways, complementary ways, and indeed many other tools. We're talking about the possibility of a case before the International Court of Justice challenging Afghanistan's violations of the CEDAW Convention. We're talking about the possibility of universal jurisdiction, and an Afghan jurist, Azadeh Raz Mohammed, is doing some very important work in Australia on how these kinds of cases might be brought against various Taliban officials over time and others for violations of human rights in Afghanistan, using something called universal jurisdiction, which allows these cases to be brought in any court around the world. But I want to pick up on something Rangita said earlier today, and that is that, of course, this all tools approach is not new, that women human rights defenders and feminist international legal theorists have been advocating this kind of complementary approach for a long time. But isn't it funny how we start talking about women and suddenly we're told that we really should do with just one tool, or how could women possibly ask for more than one mechanism? And I think there's no accident that that happens.
Thank you. I don't know, Huma or Gisu, if you have any reactions to the question as well. Okay. Gisu, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Not on that particular piece, but I did want to circle back to one question that was asked in closing around what justice for victims looks like, because I do think that a lot of times that gap is so critical, and one that a lot of this isn't really accessible to the people that I speak to in Iran, the victim community that I'm really close to. I can't say that I have the same level of closeness with other impacted communities that I work on projects with because of language barriers or cultural barriers, or the need to use an interpreter, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes the vision of what justice is for them is not going to accord with some of the standards that we might set for what what different international legal practitioners or academics think justice is. And I want to give one example because I do think it helps color the conversation about how we approach this and what's really going to make things end. So I think that for a lot of survivors of these abuses, at this point, they just want the perpetrators to stop perpetrating the abuses by almost any means necessary. And so that's why I say like that the work that we're doing around recognition of gender apartheid really isn't only to recognize this as a law and to have it be enforceable in courts. It's really to try to think through this question of third state complicity, to try to think through what is going to get these authoritative bodies to stop engaging in these kinds of practices. And this might be a bit of an extreme example, but recently the former president of Iran was killed in a helicopter crash suddenly. And this is a man who has perpetrated atrocity crimes in the country since the 1980s. He is a decades-long perpetrator. There were many survivors, women survivors of the recent women life freedom protests who were blinded by Iranian state security forces, who were tortured in custody by Iranian state security forces simply for demanding bodily autonomy and their human rights. And they were rejoicing at his death. And they didn't care if he ultimately ended up in a courtroom. They were just happy to see him gone. And there were some lawyers that came online and said things like, we wish, we could have, seen a day when he was in court. But we kind of had to accept the reality that the guy hadn't been brought to court, at least for decades. And that was something that we were grappling with. And these women, at least in that moment, were feeling really jubilant over this news. And so sometimes I think this raises questions for how we navigate those conversations, how we navigate those spaces. But sometimes the vision of what is wanted or needed can actually be at odds a bit with what it is that others are pursuing. And so just to underscore, I agree with what everybody on this panel has said, that it's really about centering, what do survivors actually want? Because the answers can often be really unexpected. And that might not be something that we would be delivering on for one reason or another, but it just really helps inform the perspective of what's important, and we shouldn't make assumptions about it. So I just thought that was an incredibly important question and wanted to raise that point.
Thank you, Gisu. Are there any other questions in the room here? And for anyone watching online, you can, of course, type a question into the comments on the side. Last call for questions? No? All right. Then I will turn it over to my colleague Payam to say a few closing words. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. It has been quite a remarkable meeting. We had a closed session, Chatham House rules, before this public event. And of course, I'm very proud to say that on International Women's Day, March 8th, we had another inaugural conference on gender persecution focusing on Iran and Afghanistan. And I'm really grateful for the support of Massey College, for the partnership now with Madre and the University of Western Ontario. And I think it's really important not to have one-off events, because the reality is still there. It's not that it's a fashionable issue to discuss now and to forget those women and girls and men and boys are still there, and the suffering continues. So it's essential for us to continue these activities and to constantly be asking the question of how is this relevant for those on the front lines, those who don't have the privilege of being in our midst. How can we listen to their voices? As Gisu said, even when what they want may be different than what we think they want, we have to listen to them and we have to adjust our strategies accordingly. And of course, this is not something that happens suddenly. It's a process. It evolves over time. I began this morning in the closed door session that we had by speaking about a remarkable experience I had on December 10th, International Human Rights Day, when I was in Oslo for the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony for my amazing colleague Nargis Mohammadi, who of course is in prison. And in front of the room in this stately event with the King and Queen of Norway and all sorts of other distinguished personalities and officials, there is a chair which is reserved for the recipient of the prize. And that chair, of course, was empty because Narges Mohammadi, instead of being celebrated in Iran, is in prison. And on either side of that chair were her twin children who have not seen their mother for 10 years. And it was a reminder of the intimate reality of human rights activism, not in our part of the world, but for those who have to witness from the prison their children being robbed of the love and guidance of a mother for a lifetime. And it gives me great pleasure to see here that the chairs are not empty. The chairs are full. And we have to, in a sense, despite the overwhelming odds against women and girls, take our inspiration not just from the despair that we feel at the apparent regression that we've witnessed in recent times, but also take inspiration from the extraordinary resilience of people like the woman in Afghanistan in the video that you showed today, who sings on the streets in Kabul because even her voice has become criminalized in a public space. And she is saying, as she's singing in the very beautiful Afghan Dari accent, that I'm singing to stay alive. I'm singing in order to remain a human being. So on that note, I will end as we Iranians and Afghans love poetry. We have to end with a poem. And this poem is from Forough Farrokhzad, who is a renowned Iranian feminist, who says, من آن شمعم که با سوز دل خویش فروزان می کنم ویرانه ای را. I am that candle that with the burning of her heart will illuminate the ruins. So let us not just despair at the terrible tragedy that we see, but also celebrate the heroism, the resilience of the lionesses in Kabul, in Tehran, in Zabul, in Herat, and the many other towns and villages and classrooms and all the different byways of life where this struggle is really being fought. And let us rededicate our efforts to do even more to help bring them to a better tomorrow. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank our amazing participants and also to thank once again Professor Osterfeld for agreeing to hold this very important event at Massey College. Thank you.
Thank you.